In the City of Angels, the brightest stars often cast the longest shadows, and before he left us, the man they called Spartacus decided it was finally time to step out of the light and into the truth. Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s and was a carefully constructed fortress of artifice, guarded by studio fixers and iron-clad contracts. But what happens when the veneer cracks? Kirk Douglas, a legendary titan of the screen, lived long enough to see the statues crumble. He witnessed the Spartans' silence. Were these titans truly the heroes we saw on screen? Or were they evil villains running from something or someone? Tonight, we explore the figures Kirk knew best, the men and women who were adored by millions, yet remained in their final hours, utterly alone. Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift was the man who changed the way the world looked at a leading man. Before he arrived, Hollywood was a place of booming baritones and square-jawed certainty. Clift brought something different, a raw, trembling vulnerability that made him the most iconic face of a new, sensitive generation. He was the beautiful loser, a star whose internal light was so bright it seemed to burn him from the inside out. Kirk Douglas watched as Clift rose to the heights of the Golden Age, yet he also saw the moment the foundation began to crumble. Kirk Douglas was a force of nature who carved his way through the studio system with the same relentless intensity he brought to the character of Spartacus. While others were content to be puppets of the powerful moguls, Kirk was a man who dared to look behind the curtain. He lived to be 103 years old, a century of observation that allowed him to see the rise and fall of every titan in the industry. He understood that the Golden Age was a carefully curated lie. It was a world where a publicist could erase a crime with a single phone call, and where the most iconic faces were often masks for the most hollowed-out souls. Kirk's perspective was unique because he was the ultimate insider who remained a perpetual outsider. He broke the back of the Hollywood blacklist by hiring Dalton Trumbo, an act that signaled his refusal to play by the cowardly rules of the era. This defiance gave him a front-row seat to the true nature of his peers. The incident that would define Clift's life and legacy occurred on a misty night in 1956. While driving home from a party at the house of his close friend Elizabeth Taylor, Clift's car slammed into a telephone pole. The impact was so severe that it literally reset the trajectory of his existence. Taylor herself reportedly reached into his mouth to pull out teeth that were choking him, saving his life but unable to save his legendary face. Surgery could rebuild the bone, but it could never restore the soul that had been shattered. In the years that followed, the sets Clift inhabited were filled with a restless energy that made his colleagues uneasy. There was a cloying scent of medicinal alcohol that seemed to follow him, mixed with the sharp tang of expensive cologne used to mask his growing dependencies. On the set of The Misfits, the atmosphere was thick with a chilling sense of impending doom. Witnesses spoke of a watchful presence in his eyes, as if he were already looking past the living world. He would sit in the dark of his New York brownstone for hours, staring at his own image on a projector, mourning the man he used to be. It was a tragic irony that the man who had pioneered the method and emotional honesty was now forced to live behind a mask of scar tissue and painkillers. Kirk Douglas observed this slow-motion tragedy with a profound sense of heartbreak. He saw a man who was utterly alone, even when surrounded by the most famous people on the planet. Clift's final years were a carousel of unfinished business and a desperate search for a piece that the industry simply would not allow him to find. He died at only 45 years old, but those who knew him felt he had been a ghost for a decade. His story is the ultimate reminder that in the Golden Age, the price of being a god was often the loss of one's humanity. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford was the ultimate construct of the Hollywood dream. She was a woman who had willed herself into existence, rising from the poverty of Lucille Le Sueur to become the personification of MGM glamour. To the public, she was the epitome of resilience and style, but to those who shared the air with her, she was a force that demanded total submission. Kirk Douglas was no stranger to the intensity of leading ladies, yet he recognized that Joan operated on a different, more predatory level. She did not just occupy a room, she consumed it. The incident that solidified her reputation as a figure of fear was not a single moment, but a lifetime of calculated control. Her obsessive nature was legendary, manifesting in a domestic life that felt more like a military camp than a home. Behind the scenes, the polished exterior of the star hid a woman who was reportedly driven by a chilling need for perfection that bordered on the pathological. The stories of her interactions with her children and staff painted a picture of a woman who viewed vulnerability as a sin and disobedience as a declaration of war. Entering Joan Crawford's orbit was like stepping into a refrigerated vault. The sensory experience of her presence was defined by the sharp, antiseptic smell of lemon water and heavy bleach, as she was famously terrified of germs and disorder. Assistants often spoke of a watchful presence that seemed to linger even after she had left the set. There were reports of cold spots in her pristine dressing rooms, areas where the air felt unnaturally still and heavy. This was not a paranormal phenomenon in the traditional sense, but rather the weight of a personality so suffocating that it left a permanent mark on the physical space around her. The tragic irony of Joan's life was that her evil was born from a desperate, clawing loneliness. She was a woman who had been discarded by the world in her youth and spent the rest of her life ensuring it could never happen again. In her final years, she became a recluse, surrounded by the plastic-covered furniture and the memories of a crown that had long since tarnished. Kirk Douglas saw her as a survivor who had forgotten how to live without a weapon in her hand. Her legacy is one of absolute power and absolute isolation, a haunting reminder that the price of eternal stardom is often the soul of the person who wears the name. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn was the living embodiment of the word swashbuckler. With a mischievous glint in his eye and a sword in his hand, he became the man every man in the audience secretly wanted to be, and every woman wanted to be with. He was the golden boy of Warner Brothers, a star who seemed to float above the mundane worries of the Great Depression and the war years. Kirk Douglas recognized that Flynn was not just playing a role, he was living a life that was a dangerous blur of fiction and reality. However, the brightness of his screen persona was a direct contrast to the murky depths of his private world. The incident that shattered the illusion of the noble rogue was a series of statutory rape trials in the early 1940s. While he was ultimately acquitted, the proceedings pulled back the curtain on a life of profound debauchery and a predatory disregard for the boundaries of others. This was the moment the hero of Sherwood Forest became a tabloid fixture for all the wrong reasons. Kirk watched as Flynn transitioned from a symbol of vitality into a tragic caricature of himself. The man who once leaped across castle battlements was now stumbling through the back alleys of his own reputation. The sensory details of Flynn's final years were particularly haunting. The salty air of his yacht, the Zaka, was said to be thick with the smell of gin and rotting wood. On board, the laughter of his guests allegedly carried a chilling edge, a frantic attempt to ignore the fact that the party was over. Later owners of the vessel reported unexplainable phenomena, including the sound of phantom footsteps on the deck and the clinking of invisible glasses in the galley at midnight. There was a watchful presence felt in the cabins, a restless energy of a man who could never find a port that felt like home. Flynn's conclusion was one of devastating loneliness. He died at the age of 50, but his body was so ravaged by excess that the medical examiner reportedly mistook him for a man in his 70s. He had spent his life running from the boredom of reality, only to find himself trapped in a cage of his own making. Kirk Douglas saw in Flynn the ultimate warning of the Golden Age, that a life lived without limits eventually finds its walls, and they are usually made of stone. John Wayne. John Wayne was more than an actor. He was the Duke, the ultimate symbol of American masculinity, and the rugged individualist who tamed the Wild West on the silver screen. To millions of fans, he represented a clear set of values: courage, strength, and an unwavering sense of justice. Kirk Douglas worked alongside Wayne and saw the immense gravity he pulled into every room. However, Kirk also recognized that the man behind the badge was a complex architect of power who used his influence to enforce a very specific and often exclusionary vision of Hollywood. The incident that defines the darker side of Wayne's legacy was his fervent involvement with the Motion Picture Alliance for the preservation of American ideals. He was a primary driver behind the blacklisting of writers and actors, using his stature to ensure that those with dissenting political views were cast out of the industry. While he played the hero on screen, he was a ruthless political operative behind the scenes. Kirk Douglas, who famously fought to end the blacklist, stood on the opposite side of this moral divide, watching as Wayne's Shadow King persona dismantled the lives of his colleagues. The atmosphere surrounding Wayne was often defined by a heavy heat. This was literally true during the filming of The Conqueror in the Utah desert, where the cast was exposed to radioactive dust from nearby nuclear testing sites. Witnesses from his sets spoke of a watchful, stern energy that demanded absolute loyalty. There was a chilling sense that to cross the Duke was to be exiled from the frontier entirely. In his final years, Wayne became a man out of time, standing guard over a version of America that was rapidly fading. He was a lonely titan, trapped by the weight of his own legend and the uncompromising world he helped to build. Lana Turner. Lana Turner was the quintessential sweater girl, a star discovered at a soda fountain who became the ultimate personification of Hollywood's femme fatale. With her platinum hair and smoldering gaze, she was the crown jewel of MGM, a woman whose beauty was so potent it seemed to vibrate off the screen. Kirk Douglas saw her as the heart of the studio system's glamour, yet he also understood that Lana was a woman perpetually walking a tightrope over a very dark abyss. While her films were fantasies of romance, her private reality was often a nightmare of bad choices and dangerous men. The incident that would forever stain her legacy occurred on a Good Friday in 1958. Lana had become entangled with Johnny Stompanato, a brutal mob enforcer with ties to the Mickey Cohen crime family. Their relationship was a volatile mix of obsession and violence. That night, during a heated argument in her Beverly Hills bedroom, Lana's teenage daughter, Cheryl Crane, intervened with a kitchen knife to protect her mother. Stompanato was killed, and the subsequent investigation turned the Turner household into the center of a national scandal. The tragedy pulled back the curtain on the terrifying underworld that often simmered just beneath the surface of the Golden Age's high society. The sensory details of that era are suffocating. Witnesses described the stifling humidity of that Beverly Hills night, a heavy stillness broken only by the sound of sirens. In the aftermath, a restless energy seemed to cling to Lana like a second skin. Even on the brightest sets, colleagues reported a chilling sense of bad luck that followed her, a feeling that she was haunted by a watchful presence she could never shake. The eerie stillness of the courtroom where she testified felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a funeral for her innocence. Lana's story concludes with a profound sense of heartbreak. She was a woman who sought love in the most dangerous places, only to find herself isolated by the very fame that was supposed to protect her. She lived out her final years with the weight of a daughter's trauma and the memory of a night that could never be erased. Kirk Douglas saw in Lana the ultimate fragile force, a woman who could command the world's attention, but could never find safety in her own home. Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre was a man whose very presence on screen suggested a secret that was too heavy to carry. With his large, soulful eyes and a voice that sounded like a velvet whisper from the shadows, he became the most distinctive character actor of the Golden Age. From his chilling debut in the German film M to his iconic roles in The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca, Lorre was the master of the macabre. Kirk Douglas recognized that Lorre was a man of immense intellectual depth and sensitivity. Yet the Hollywood machine only saw a monster they could market to a frightened public. The incident that truly haunted Lorre's career was his slow marginalization by the very studios that had once hailed him as a genius. As he aged, he was increasingly relegated to low-budget horror parodies and roles that mocked his unique physicality. This creative stagnation led him down a dark path of morphine addiction, a habit he originally picked up to manage chronic pain, but which eventually became a ghost that followed him into every room. Kirk Douglas watched as this brilliant, multilingual scholar was reduced to a punchline, a man whose real talents were being buried alive by the industry's narrow imagination. The sensory experience of being around Peter Lorre in his later years was deeply unsettling. Witnesses often spoke of the dimly lit corners of the Warner Brothers lot where he would retreat, the air around him thick with the smell of heavy tobacco and a chilling sense of exhaustion. There was a watchful presence in his gaze, as if he were observing a world that no longer had a place for him. Colleagues reported a restless energy in his performance, a desperate attempt to find something meaningful in scripts that were beneath him. The eerie stillness of his dressing room felt like a sanctuary for a man who was tired of being the world's favorite creep. Lorne's conclusion is one of profound, quiet tragedy. He died at the relatively young age of 59, having spent his final years as a man who felt like a guest in his own life. He was a lonely intellectual in a town that valued sensation over substance. Kirk Douglas saw in Lorre the ultimate silent ghost, a man whose brilliance was visible to everyone, but whose humanity was ignored by all. Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby was the voice that defined the American century. To a world ravaged by war and economic depression, he was more than just a singer or an actor. He was a sonic comfort blanket. With his pipe, his easy grin, and that incomparable bass baritone croon, he became Father O'Malley, the man who could soothe a nation's soul with a single note. He was the most beloved man in the world, the architect of the modern Christmas, and the undisputed king of multimedia before the term even existed. Kirk Douglas witnessed the sheer magnitude of Crosby's influence, noting how the man seemed to carry an aura of effortless grace that made everyone around him feel at ease. Yet, as Kirk would later observe, the Der Bingle persona was a masterpiece of studio engineering that masked a domestic reality of chilling detachment. The incident that shattered the stained glass image of Bing Crosby did not come during his lifetime, but rather in the years following his death in 1977. It arrived in the form of a devastating memoir titled Going My Own Way, written by his eldest son, Gary Crosby. The book pulled back the velvet curtain on a household that functioned less like a family and more like a high-security reform school. Gary described a father who was a cold, distant disciplinarian, a man who allegedly used a leather belt to whip his sons for the slightest infractions, such as leaving a toy on the floor or failing to achieve perfect grades. The easygoing Bing the public adored was, according to those who shared his blood, a phantom. The man who sang about the joys of a white Christmas presided over a home that was described as a place of persistent fear and emotional isolation. Bing Crosby could connect with millions of strangers through a microphone, yet he remained a stranger to his own children. Kirk Douglas, who valued the bonds of family above almost all else, found the revelations about Crosby to be a haunting reminder of the Golden Age's capacity for deception. He saw a man who had become a prisoner of his own impeccable brand. Crosby had spent decades perfecting a version of fatherhood for the screen that he simply did not know how to replicate in reality. This was the lost boy of Hollywood, a man who had grown so used to the scripted perfection of a film set that he viewed the unpredictability of his children as a defect to be corrected through force. The conclusion of Crosby's story is one of profound heartbreak and a legacy divided against itself. While his voice continues to soundtrack the holiday season for billions, the shadow of his private life remains an unresolved mystery for many. Two of his sons from his first marriage eventually took their own lives, a tragic postscript to a childhood spent under the thumb of a man who could harmonize with the world, but couldn't find a common chord with his family. He died on a golf course in Spain, a solitary figure in a landscape he loved, leaving behind a fortune, a legendary catalog of music, and a family that was still trying to find the man behind the croon. Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck was known in the industry as the Queen, a title she earned not through a royal lineage, but through a terrifyingly consistent display of professional iron. She was the woman who could play a card sharp, a corporate titan, or a murderous housewife with equal bone-chilling conviction. In a town built on the backs of fragile egos and manufactured starlets, Stanwyck was the anomaly. A self-made orphan from Brooklyn who never missed a mark and never asked for a favor. Kirk Douglas revered her, recognizing a fellow street fighter who had clawed her way to the top of the mountain. Yet, as he observed her over the decades, he saw that the armor she wore to survive the Golden Age had eventually fused to her skin, leaving a woman who was as magnificent as she was profoundly alone. Unlike her peers who clung to the limelight through desperate cameos or tabloid antics, Stanwyck chose a path of sharp, unsentimental isolation. After her high-profile and ultimately heartbreaking divorce from Robert Taylor, the man many believe was the only true love of her life, she retreated into a fortress of her own making. Kirk watched as she became a dark star, a celestial body that still possessed immense mass and gravity, but refused to emit any more light for the public to consume. She became a woman who lived by a code of silence that was as rigid as the scripts she once mastered, cutting off even those who had been her closest allies when they failed to meet her exacting standards of loyalty. The tragic irony of Barbara Stanwyck was that her greatest strength, her invulnerability, became her ultimate prison. She had spent a lifetime proving she didn't need anyone, and in the end, the world took her at her word. Her conclusion is one of a devastating, self-imposed loneliness. She died in 1990, leaving behind a body of work that remains the gold standard for acting, yet she left instructions for no funeral and no memorial service. She wanted to vanish as efficiently as she had worked. Kirk Douglas saw in her the cost of total independence in a town that feeds on connection. She was a woman who conquered Hollywood, but found that the view from the top was a landscape of beautiful, empty silence. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was more than a singer. He was the chairman of the board, a title reflecting a level of systemic power rarely seen in the history of entertainment. He was the man who could make a career with a nod or end one with a single phone call. To the public, he was the leader of the Rat Pack, the finger-snapping king of the Sands Hotel, who moved through life with an entourage of the cool and the connected. Kirk Douglas, however, understood that Sinatra's influence extended far beyond the neon lights of the Vegas Strip. He was a man who operated at the intersection of Hollywood glamour and the cold, calculated world of the underworld, a position that gave him a gravity that was both intoxicating and terrifying. The atmosphere surrounding Sinatra was defined by a heavy, expectant silence. In his presence, the air often felt thick, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath to see which version of Frank would emerge. Would it be the generous benefactor or the vengeful titan? Witnesses spoke of a watchful presence that seemed to extend across the globe. Even when he was not in the room, his influence was felt like a low-frequency hum. There was a chilling quality to his gaze, a blue-eyed intensity that could turn from warm to glacial in a heartbeat. The eerie stillness of his private suites at the Sands was a place where the only sound was the clinking of ice in a glass. This was a restless energy that signaled a man who never truly slept and never truly trusted. The incident that defined the darker side of Sinatra's reign was his legendary capacity for scorched earth retaliation. Those who crossed him, whether it was a journalist who wrote a disparaging line or a fellow actor who failed to show proper deference, found themselves effectively erased. Reputations would disappear overnight, and doors that were once open would suddenly, chillingly lock tight. Kirk Douglas saw how the chairman's wrath could create a vacuum around a person, leaving them isolated in a town that thrives on proximity to power. It was a brand of evil that was not born of chaos, but of a rigid, uncompromising demand for absolute loyalty and the enforcement of a shadow law that governed the Golden Age. Kirk once noted that Sinatra lived in a world where the rules of ordinary men did not apply. This was a man who could summon the most powerful people in the country to his table, but who often chose the company of those who lived in the dark. The tragic irony of his life was that the more power he amassed, the more paranoid he became. He was haunted by the friends he had lost to his own temper and the favors he owed to men in the shadows. He had achieved the ultimate status, yet he remained a man plagued by a deep, hollow loneliness that no amount of applause could ever truly fill. Sinatra's conclusion is one of a man who outlived his era but could never escape its ghosts. He ended his days as a restless spirit, a monarch of a kingdom that had moved on without him. He had spent a lifetime building a fortress of influence, only to find that it was a gilded cage. Kirk Douglas saw in Sinatra the final, grand tragedy of the Golden Age, that the higher you climb in a kingdom built on secrets, the further you have to fall when the curtain finally comes down. Kirk Douglas lived through a century of secrets, witnessing the high price of the pedestal and the heavy weight of the Spartan's silence. Were these icons the masters of their fate, or were they merely the most beautiful casualties of a system that demanded their souls in exchange for immortality? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Ensure you hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into Hollywood's unresolved mysteries.